Thanks, yeah, and thank you for being here. I have the great honor of introducing our guest, and so I'll do that now. Harry Schnipper is a native Washingtonian, the other Washington, D.C., a resident of Ward 6 and president of the International Realty Group. He was born and raised in Washington, D.C. and Bethesda, Maryland, where he attended Walt Whitman High School, Earlham College, and the University of Maryland. He received an undergraduate degree in urban development and pursued his master's degree in finance. He's a 30-year veteran of the metropolitan real estate community, and his most notable projects have included the alternative use redevelopment of historic landmark properties in the nation's capital. He's authored numerous articles for the Washington Business Journal, the Washington Times, the Commercial Brokers Quarterly, and the Corridor Real Estate Journal. Mr. Schnipper is the owner of Blues Alley Jazz, LLC. Blues Alley Jazz is America's oldest continuously operating jazz supper club. He's a lifelong resident of Capitol Hill, where he lives with his wife, Madeline. And I'll just add to this biography that he works tirelessly on behalf of music education, specifically jazz music education, doing things like this, talking to young musicians, helping you know what you don't know yet, and how to form a career. And so we are just really very excited to have him here. Would you please help me welcome Mr. Harry Schnipper?
So I would like to posit a few questions prior to proceeding.
Go for it.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Dr. Samples. I am going to immediately pull it down and update it. That was probably written about a decade ago. And frankly, I like to begin every interview, lecture, or conversation by introducing a few questions. And the first question is, raise your hand if are you all from Washington State, for the most part? And have you ever been to Blues Alley Jazz? Raise your hand if you have. So, I own America's oldest continuously operated jazz supper club. We've been around for 54 years. I produce, present, or promote at least one act, artist, or event every day. I tell people my moving parts have moving parts. It also makes me one of the unique individuals of who I am in a very small company. And I tell you that today because I had lunch a few hours ago with John Demetria, who is the owner of Jazz Alley. I don't know is everybody familiar with Jazz Alley? Okay. John used to work for Blues Alley. That's how intertwined we are. And when I sat down at lunch, I said, I think there's only about 12 of us in the entire United States who do what we do, because it is not for the weak of heart. It's a complex puzzle, and in order to be able to successfully do that day in and day out, you have to have a very competent staff. So in preparation for this interview and conversation today, I prepared an outline, an agenda, a series of talking points, and the following questions, which I am going to introduce right now before we go any further. And in contemplating this trip out here, I decided to reflect on all of the questions that I ask others. So this is not something that's unique to you. I ask this of everybody. And the first question is, what do you want to be when you grow up? The older they are, the more they have a propensity to say, I'm not grown up yet. But everybody wants to be something when they grow up. Then I ask people, well, what is your legacy going to be? What are you going to leave behind? And then, how can we leave the world a better place than the one we found? What is inspiration to you, and what inspires you to do what it is you do? The next question I ask is, what do you want to realize from this experience? You only get this one moment in time. I have a saying that every opportunity, every day I get up, and I hope I have an historic experience. And that is so important, because with all of the experiences that you're going to have of your lifetime, it's important that you put everyone aside and say, oh, like in a musical experience. A musical experience can take on all kinds of dimensions, but it's very important that you proactively approach it. And finally, I ask people all the time, how can I help you help me help you? It's a line from a 1990s movie called Jerry Maguire, starring, hey, you, come on down. Those are asbestos seats.
Come all the way to the front.
If you're going to contaminate anybody, I want you to down here in front. No, it's what happens all the time. Then I have to talk really loud. I'm too old to talk loud. So how can I help you help me help you? It's absolutely imperative to understand that every single artist, act, or event that I present, promote, or produce is a symbiotic relationship. I can't be open 360 days of the year unless people bring me talent. So that is what I do. I'm always in search of the next big thing, because that's what you jazzers are all about. You know, I'm a jazzer. I grew up, and I always never wanted to say, oh man, that was last night, I missed that? Oh gosh, okay. So we're going to have a really great experience here for you tonight. Hopefully you'll have some questions at the end. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Samples.
Yeah, this is great. And there are a couple things I want to unpack there. One thing is that what do you want to do when you grow up? And I wonder if you would take us back a little bit in your own life. And was this what you wanted to do when you grew up? That's, I guess, the first question. And then the second question is, how did you get into this business, into the music industry, particularly owning Blues Alley?
I think that's 3 questions. So I thought about this question long and hard, not that you had posited it per se, but in anticipation of it. I was that kid in your neighborhood who would organize carnivals, and I was the one who was raising funds, and I was the one who was putting on all kinds of things when I was just a kid. And then I went on to college, and lo and behold, they had an empty seat in the entertainment committee. And I was at a small college in the Midwest. And I said, wow, I get to do that? I can do that. So I got to run with people like Ralph Towner and his band Oregon, and Paul Winter Consort, and so many outstanding musicians back when I was a young man. And to answer your question, I think I've been doing this all my life, Dr. Samples. Even as I got older, well, let me regress. When I was in high school, I used to go to the club that I owned. So who would have known, 40, 50 years later that I would own this club? But I understood the provenance of it. I understood the tradition that it represented. And I had a tremendous burden to make sure that I challenged my audiences every night. When I say this, who better in the world to have a job where you are responsible for throwing a party every day, every single night, and to make sure that it is such a magical experience that people go away and go, I'm going to tell everybody about this. This is amazing. And so that's the answer to the second question. What was the third one?
How did you get into this particular, or how did you come to own Blues Alley?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So that's interesting. We have what is called, and I'm going to try to give you the real condensed version of this. We're not like Jazz Alley, and that was one of the reasons why I sat down with John today to go over the years and the decades that have transpired since he was working with us. And he didn't have the same takeaway, and there's a good reason for not having the same takeaway. When you look at life and you say, I'm a member of the very few, select few, whose responsibility is to carry on the tradition of jazz music. I looked at the uniqueness of the Washington, D.C. market And I realized that we are what I call a cultural anomaly. And the reason I call it a cultural anomaly was because I live in the nation's capital, which is governed by the federal government, right? And all of the presenters that I was competing with as the jazz clubs were closing, not opening, were the nonprofit cultural institutions like the Smithsonian Institution, the Kennedy Center, all these major ones, and they didn't think twice about putting me out of business. You know, their objective was to put out plain vanilla packaging and constantly regurgitate the same acts. Can I say Wynton Marsalis and the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra? Nothing to take away from Wynton. I mean, he is the poster child of jazz. But at the end of the day, is he doing really creative things anymore? Do you know what his #1 selling album is? Live at Blues Alley, 1986. So from my point of view, I saw it as a challenge. And in 1985, Dizzy Gillespie came to us and said, you need to start a nonprofit. We were like, we're a for-profit jazz venue. Why would we need to have a nonprofit? And I'm going somewhere with this, and bear with me. So I became the head of the nonprofit. And as I got experience, and I had no business, I was a professional real estate developer. And as I got more and more involved giving back, I realized that there was no nonprofit programming, music education programming outside of Washington, D.C. None of the big institutions took on what I did, which was today having graduated students from every major music school and conservatory in America. I took that on as a responsibility, knowing, as Dizzy did, that the next generation of artists and audiences would be passing through the ranks of our programs. So with that said, we began in the 1990s, and we began to expand the footprint of our nonprofit programming to include an international jazz vocal competition, a summer jazz camp for kids. There's nothing else like that going on. Nobody's producing anything like that. And finally, I created a student big band festival every April in partnership with the Smithsonian Institution. So the answer is, I saw that there was an opportunity to use the nonprofit platform for goodwill as an ability to augment what we were programming on the for-profit level.
And it might be interesting or helpful for us for you to talk a little bit about the distinction between for-profit and non-profit institutions in this case, because Blues Alley is a for-profit jazz club. That's not the case across the country. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of that distinction?
Your questions are short and my answers are long.
That's how it should be.
You know, on the one hand, it's really interesting that nonprofits have flourished, and I was explaining earlier that somehow we got caught in this incredibly dark hole where we thought that either jazz was dead, or like American classical music, it needed to be underwritten by foundations in order to be able to be financially successful, which from a business point of view is an oxymoron. And I began to realize that I could compete with my nonprofit counterparts, and/or I could actually start producing performances that would otherwise fall within the nonprofit category, and I can seek out competitive foundation funding for these. So while on the one hand, I go out there and creatively curate my calendar in a way in which I challenge my audiences, but at the same time, there's a great deal of mainstream music that I produce, and of course, Wynton Marsalis and the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra being one of the more obvious ones. But I produced so many performances in concert. Also, I also like to hasten to point out, Dr. Samples, that 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, jazz clubs were the front line of all performances, and now the concert hall has. So if you haven't been to Blues Alley, can you imagine a room about the size of this stage right here, in which you're standing in front of your... This weekend is Arturo Sandoval. Anybody ever heard of Arturo Sandoval? 4 nights of Arturo, sitting this close to him. It's a concert hall experience in an intimate environment. So I'm passionate about that. I think that it's absolutely necessary. I wish there were more jazz clubs, because jazz is such an important medium of American arts and entertainment, and yet at the same time, it's been subjugated to large concert halls.
And that's part of what I think makes Blues Alley so remarkable, is that it's a for-profit jazz club, and it's the history of jazz is filled with failed jazz clubs. As you said, all the doors are closing, and yours are not. So I want to back up just one step, because you've talked a lot about DC, and I know that you've spent not only much of your career, but much of your life in DC. And can you tell us a little bit about the DC scene? Give us a little history about the DC scene and what makes it distinctive or important with regard to jazz specifically?
Yes. And I was hoping you'd ask that question. And I thought to myself, I'd like to reframe the question by answering another question that you didn't ask, which is jazz successful in Washington, D.C., and why isn't it like L.A. or Chicago or New York? And I tell people, I'm not really in the entertainment industry. I'm in the data mining industry. Because if I don't sit down and figure out precisely what your profile is when you come into my club, I can't continue to present challenging performances. And by that I mean Washington is its own unique business model. And the answer to the first question is, Washington is actually the largest small town in America. We only have 863,000 people who live in the city. But early on, I adopted the internet. And we all know what the internet is, right? Every time you push send and purchase a ticket from me, in any capacity, I know where you live, what you do, how much you can spend. I oftentimes tell people, the Blues Alley customer is overeducated, over-incomed, and over-traveled. And they have the ability to spend a lot of money on a weekend act. And so with that said, my feeling was that Washington, D.C. was unique. We are the home to the federal government, so consequently we have a large transient business population that's there from Monday through Thursday. And oftentimes they want to go out to be entertained. Second of all, we are also the capital of all of the embassies. So I began to tap into, about 2 decades ago, all of the artists that were coming in from overseas. Many of you who do not know their names maybe, but you probably recognize their music. And third, Washington, D.C. is a military capital, and we have the armed forces presence there. And if you've never heard the Navy Commodores, the Airmen of Note, or the U.S. Army Blues, these are three. The DNA of D.C. is what I'm getting at, is really big band. So with that, tapping into that formula, I was able to come up with a new pattern or a new approach, a strategy, if you will, in which I was presenting music, on the one hand, that was even avant-garde and straight ahead, and then on the other, I was doing the more pedestrian because I knew that's what my audience wanted. So you've got to cater to your audience. Sometimes people say, the jazz police come in and go, that's not jazz. You know what the jazz police are? Everybody know the jazz police? That's not jazz. Like, well, what's jazz? I mean, at the end of the day, if people often ask me and they go, Harry, what would you present if you could present only what you want to present? I said, well, I'd be out of business in about 30 days. And I think that's really what it is. You don't have to dumb it down, but you know what? You can't really do divas 24/7. And you can't really do Sun Ra with Rosanne Roland Kirk and Ornette Coleman and expect your audience to go, oh yeah, we need to see avant-garde really all the time, free jazz. No, people sometimes just need, I'm going to make the analogy, sometimes you eat meat and potatoes and sometimes you just want a salad, So there are times that you just collapse and you say, my brain ain't strong enough to be able to listen to Ornette again tonight. I want to listen to something that I could otherwise, like Duke Ellington or whatever it may be. But I think the simple answer is play to your audience.
And what I think we can all take out of this is that there's no cookie-cutter answer to a career, especially if you're an entrepreneur and especially if you want to do something new. And paying attention to where you are, what the context is, and then coming up with creative solutions using what you have around you, like tapping the embassies. The way that you kind of navigate has to be tailored to your situation. You can't just plop the Blues Alley model down in Ellensburg and make it work, or even in Seattle or in LA. And
I also like to hasten to point out, people say, well, in New York, all these great jazz clubs thrive. And I go, yeah, they have 11 million people live in 8 boroughs. There's a reason why,
Yeah, and so on the subject of entrepreneurship, I know a lot of our students, a lot of the students in the audience are not only thinking about how do I be a better player, but how can I make a career? How can I really how can I design a career that will allow me to do what I love and be successful and pay the bills and all these things that, insignificant things like eating and having shelter. No, sleeping, you don't need to sleep, you're in college. So, no, I'm kidding. You do need to sleep. But here's my question for you. You have the benefit of interacting with dozens, hundreds of young, up-and-coming entrepreneurs, musicians, other people in the industry. And my question is, if you could isolate some qualities in up-and-coming entrepreneurs, musicians especially, that you see, when you see this quality in an up-and-coming industry professional, you think, this one has a chance. Are there any qualities that you're seeing in young, up-and-coming musicians or bookers or otherwise that you would share with us?
I hear at least 3 questions in there.
The main question, just the quality.
Because I have a symbiotic relationship, and I do something that a lot of people don't do. First of all, let me confess that I have 30 people that work for me, and one of them is a principal talent buyer. Everybody know what a talent buyer is? Talent buyer is the inverse of a booking agent. And I've written a series of articles on this very same subject. Mostly, and the second question is, what would you recommend in terms of alternative careers within the industry that allow you to continue to maintain your creativity while simultaneously earning an income? And the third question is, not only how do you identify talent and where it comes from, but finding the right platforms to present it. And I think having I call this a bifurcated business model. I don't know of any other for-profit jazz venue in the country, and I'm beginning to start to say the world, that has the nonprofit independently of the for-profit. So I have the versatility to be able to say, you know what, especially with big band, you're dealing with 18 members, right? And so consequently, what I did was I said, okay, well, this is a good actor-artist. What I'll do is I'll present them in a program that I've got, and maybe they're an educator, and so I could use them concurrently with that and simultaneously groom them for a larger audience. So, making reference to this, this year in Reno, I was at the Jazz Education Network conference lecturing on the subject of developing new jazz audiences. And I think there's a lot of talent. It's just that I think that the vast majority of individuals in the industry today, not like it was 20 or more years ago, do not realize that you're sitting in Ellensburg, Washington, and there's a similar corresponding interview going on in Kyoto, Japan, where there's an artist that's being interviewed by their local doctor, and what you're studying is being studied by others around the world simultaneously. So it's important to understand what your niche is. I think that's significant. I look at people all the time, and most of the peers that I have, and folks that I grew up with, and there's a point at which you say, you know what, I'm not going to be the next John Coltrane. I'm not going to be the next Miles Davis. But there are places for me to participate in the music industry process. So I think I answered all three of those questions.
So in thinking about developing a career, I want to go into this area, this new topic of entrepreneurship. So we hear a lot from our professors and from our teachers about how to play better, but we don't hear so much in school about how to be better business people, right? Entrepreneurs. So second question along this line, and you can take this in whatever direction you would like. One question, I promise. One question only this time. What is one common belief about the music industry that you think is wrong?
I'm going to say that there's only one avenue to success. I think one of the things that I preach about more than any single subject, and it's contained in my copious notes to self here, and I'm going to read, and it's not going to really answer your question, but it's going to hopefully provoke some questions from the audience, is that I am not the arbiter of cultural aesthetics. I mean, I present music. I'm in love with music. I've always had it as a part of my life. But if I had prepared myself, I mean, I didn't go to college, folks, to take Jazz Club Owners 101. I mean, it just doesn't exist. You have to have another skill set out there in order to be, and when the opportunity did arise and someone needed my real estate services, and it happened to be the owner of Blues Alley Jazz, the door opened and I was not ignorant enough to realize, oh man, the door's opening and I don't see it. And I saw was, this is an enormous opportunity for me to proceed into a career path that I had not projected. So being able to be aware of what those career paths are, what you pursue in terms of your abilities, and seeing the door and being able to recognize the door opening when it does is absolutely essential to your success. Personal success. Hopefully it's financial success as well. So from my point of view, I would say that, and I would also say you don't have to be in the nonprofit cultural community to be able to be successful. I was talking about this in the green room prior to coming in, where I was sitting at a Gen conference years ago, not terribly long, about 3 or 4 years ago, and I heard the old saw, oh, jazz is dead. And this person got up on the stage from a nonprofit cultural point of view and proceeded to spend about 50 minutes explaining to why jazz is dead. And at the end, I walked out and said, okay, if jazz is dead, how come Blues Alley is still live and well? So you can hear people say to you that this is the only avenue. And I think to myself, when your own money is on the line, when you take the risk every single day, and the potential to lose tens of thousands of dollars is always on the table. But when you're playing with your own money, it's real. It's not like you're going to call up GM and say, hey, look, we have a $100,000 shortfall because I really screwed up all the booking this year, and I'd like you to write a big underwriting check. That's a big difference than what I do. What I do is solely unique in terms of trying to, I would say, but the third point is that the nonprofit jazz cultural presenter is an oxymoron. I think you have to think entrepreneurially, but you also have to think in terms of profitability. And so therefore, once again, going back to you have to know your audience.
And hopefully many of you in the audience want to have a for-profit career. You don't want to be a non-profit artist. Of course, that's kind of a joke.
It is. It's one of the oldest jokes in the world. I have two other points.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was talking to Jacob earlier, and I said, I came to the reality on my way out here, and I traveled 3,000 miles to get here, And I said, you know what? I was an early adopter of the internet. And within a decade, I had 100,000 weekly subscribers. And I said, that's what makes me different than a nonprofit cultural institution. I have people who want to see what I am presenting. Now, if you're a cultural institution, and I don't know what you've got out here, but I did go to Seattle Center, and I was very impressed by the campus up there. And I have to say, I've never seen a city that's so tied to the arts as Seattle. And I tell you that because I realized that I am a jazz influencer. I mean, I know that word gets bandied about, but I thought to myself, I used to advertise in the Washington Post. And their subscription, their weekly or average print cycle is 323,000 people. And they're not all jazzers. So I quit print advertising. And yet what I realized about the nonprofit cultural institution business model was that the reason why they advertise, and print advertise in particular, is because their sponsors want to see their name and corporate logos in the paper. So I eliminated it. I saved myself a couple $100,000 a year right off the bat by developing along the lines of the internet and using that as the platform to present performances to my audience. And finally, always reach higher than your aim. I mean, it's simple. It sounds simple, but yet at the end of the day, don't go into life thinking, oh, I can't do that. If I had said that about Blues Alley decades ago, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you today.
So what I want to do next, we have a couple more questions I think we can get to before we open it up to you all. You'll have questions, yes? So we also collected some questions from students beforehand so that we could make sure we bring some of those to you. I want to ask just a couple of those, and I want to preface this by saying you told me earlier today that you consider yourself a professional dot connector, okay? And what I'm thinking, so this ties into one of the student questions. The student question is this, and this is unedited. I've heard in order to succeed that it's more about who you know rather than how talented you are. How true is this?
I'd like to reframe that because it may be generational. John Dimitri and I were talking about this and how it once was that the industry moved in a different way. Although I will say to some degree, my club has stood still over the course of half a century. I've worked with all of the great artists, and you ask whether or not it's a talent-driven decision, and I answer no. It's a relationship-driven decision, and I would prefer to work with somebody I like than someone who is just a real pain. And I can tell you, I'm not friends with all the artists. I never intended to be. I mean, I feel like you can ask me, oh, what's it like to work with fill in the blank? And I go, on a personal level, it's very satisfying. On a professional level, they're very difficult. And I think that's the biggest challenge that you have in knowing that. So the answer to your question is really, from my point of view, I don't know if everybody agrees with the way I do it, but because I'm not driven by profitability, I make my own decisions, and if an artist is difficult and I've got three choices, I say forget it, you know. The point that I did provide Dr. Samples is something that you'll find astonishing. I actually work in an egoless industry. If you let your ego get in the way of what it is that you're trying to do, and believe me, I was your age at one time too. Now, the desire to be always right, or the desire to always say, I know what is in best taste. The good news is I've been vindicated after a number of years, so I frankly feel like having seen all of the great artists in performance, that, and also having worked with them behind the scenes, the answer is it's more important to build a network and a foundation around that network to become a first call musician.
And would you say, what I hear you saying is that's a combination between of talent and being a good relational person to be around, someone who you want to work with. Is that true?
Yeah. In fact, my music director is a bassist by the name of Michael Bowie, and I don't expect you to know his name. But in the 90s and the aughts, for 2 decades, he was the music director for Betty Carter and Abby Lincoln. And I've worked with Michael for decades now, and he's just a joy to work with. And on Monday night when I was here in Seattle, he was at my club performing and doing a kind of a narrative storytelling history about working with those two icons. And I think that's what's so enjoyable, is to work with people that are as passionate as you, who are as engaged as you, and who don't make, I mean, it's difficult enough to get out of bed in the morning. I mean, to tie your shoes and go out there and have a purpose. But, you know, I'm like, and I know this sounds really self-indulgent, a jazz shaman, because what I do every evening is to make a magical moment that people share and come in contact with each other. And it's not like going and sitting out in an audience. These people are all bunched together in a small club. And the magnetism and the energy that's created is a special thing. And so that's the reason why I do what I do. And I like, usually if you look at my calendar and there's an artist that's repeating every year, it's because we like to work with them. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, relationships are incredibly important, and what I tell the students is it's not just being a good musician. Is you also got to be a good hang. You got to be able to hang, you know. And if no one wants you around, they're not going to call you back. One of the other student submitted questions was, how do you get someone that you want to call back? And I think this is part of the answer: is be someone who you want to see again, right? But
there are people out there who say to me, and this used to happen all the time. I worked with Ahmad Jamal for over 3 decades. He's in his 80s now, but and he doesn't play on a regular rotating basis. And then there are other artists that I worked with, like Mose Allison, and they would come in year after year after year, and they are just. I'm working right now. I've been working for the last couple of years. Do anybody know a pianist by the name of Cyrus Chestnut?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so Cyrus and I, we go way back. And when we're curating calendar, whether I'm working with Monty Alexander or whether I'm working with fill in the blank, it's all based upon a certain understanding of decades worth of conversations. And, you know, I was sitting there talking to Monty, and I were talking just a few short weeks ago. We were reminiscing about pianists, you know, and I was saying that two of the great unsung pianists of all time are Wynton Kelly and Errol Garner, and he and I could relate on a level that average people can't relate on because of course it was a generation or two before them. But the reality is that you develop a rapport, and that foundation of that rapport only increases over time.
Well, and you mentioned Cyrus Chestnut. Talk about someone who just spreads joy everywhere he goes, right? He comes in and works with you, and you just walk out thinking, wow, boy, would I like to work with him again. Is that? Of course, you have far more experience with him than I do, but that was my experience working with him many years ago.
I would say your gut is right.
Yeah.
I mean, also he grew up 30 minutes away from me, so it's not like
You know all sides of Cyrus Chestnut.
yeah. It's like, you know, you oftentimes think about this and you say, "Oh wow, I didn't know that person was from there." I go, "Yeah, you know, I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but Washington D.C. is like one of the great guitar capitals of the world. I don't know what's in the water. It's kind of like Seattle. All these musicians that come out of Seattle, and people look at me and they go, "Who came out of D.C.?" And I go, "Well, Charlie Bird, Roy Clark, Link Wray, Mike Stern. I mean, Roy Buchanan, Danny Gatton. I mean, the list is so long and legion that." People just don't know. Oh wow! I didn't know that Mike Stern came from Washington D.C. You know, and you wouldn't. And by the way, I'll put a plug in for Jazz Alley. He's coming in 2 weeks. So it's a great show. I did it about 2 months ago. It's a barn burner. I mean, you got Weckel on drums. You've got Lorber on keyboards. It's just freaking nuts.
Well, I want to say a special thanks before we end to Joe Walrath for all of the work that he's done over these many months to organize this and all the details. And I want to say special thanks to Harry Schnipper for doing a whole lot of work as well to get this ready, and for sharing with us your experience and your thoughts here tonight. Thanks so much.